Good afternoon on the East Coast, good morning on the West Coast, and welcome to the Center for New American Security's virtual conversation on confronting the domestic terrorism threat. I'm Carrie Cordero, and we've got a tremendously experienced and knowledgeable group lined up to talk with you today about how the federal government in particular is authorized, organized, and prepared to address what appears to be a growing domestic security threat in the United States. In thinking back of just some things that we've seen this week, in particular with the confirmation hearing of Attorney General nominee Merrick Garland, he mentioned the discussion and his experience in prosecuting the Oklahoma City bombing, which was back in 1995, as a lead prosecutor in that case. And he also discussed the Department of Justice's founding in countering the Ku Klux Klan. And what part of that discussion revealed is that domestic terrorism in the United States is not necessarily a new phenomenon. It's been something that the government has been addressing throughout our history. But in the wake of the events of January 6th and that insurrection and attack on the Capitol, which was violent activity in pursuit of a political objective, which was to prevent the certification of the 2020 election. The increase of domestic terrorism throughout the United States is becoming more front and center from a public policy discussion and perspective. And already we are starting to see conversations take place, consideration and debate potentially in Congress and throughout Washington about whether new laws, for example, are needed to address this current threat. So that increasing visibility and urgency raises important questions and policy national security questions. And some of these include whether our current government institutions are adequately resourced, prepared, have the right laws in order to meet this current threat. A part of that conversation, and a really significant part of it, is what are the civil liberties and privacy implications of going down that path, potentially, of having some new laws in this area. And so we've assembled a group today, and I want to take a moment to introduce them to you because each brings a really unique experience in terms of their professional experience in government that they bring to this conversation. And I'm really delighted that each of them is available to join us today for this. First, I'd like to introduce Christian Beckner, who is currently the Senior Director of Retail Technology and Cybersecurity at the National Retail Federation. Christian spent 5 years as Deputy Director of the George Washington University Center for Cyber and Homeland Security. Previously, he has substantial experience in congressional oversight as he was the Associate Staff Director at the Senate Homeland Security and Government Affairs Committee, where he was responsible for coordination and oversight and overseeing legislation on a broad range of intelligence and homeland security issues. Josh Campbell is also joining us. Josh is a current correspondent on national security and law enforcement matters with CNN, and he was previously a supervisory special agent with the FBI, where he conducted counterterrorism, kidnapping, cyber, and counterintelligence investigations. He also served as special assistant to the FBI director, and in his current capacity has covered a lot of the domestic protest and violent extremist activity in the country. Alexis Collins is currently a litigation partner at a law firm of Cleary, Gottlieb, Steen & Hamilton. Alexis was previously counsel to the Assistant Attorney General for National Security at the Justice Department. She served, very relevant to this conversation, as the Deputy Chief of the Counterterrorism Section in the National Security Division, where she supervised, oversaw, and prosecuted terrorism cases, including international terrorism and domestic terrorism cases. She had previously served as a trial attorney in the counterterrorism section and was an assistant United States attorney in the Eastern District of New York. And to bring us with some intelligence community perspective, we also welcome Alex Joel. who will round out our panel. Alex is currently a scholar in residence and adjunct professor at the Washington College of Law at American University. He was previously the chief of the Office of Civil Liberties, Privacy, and Transparency at the ODNI, and he was the first person to hold that job from when the ODNI was created and stood up in 2005. In that capacity, he provided a wide array of advice and counsel on civil liberties, privacy, transparency to the DNI and to the entire intelligence community. And he previously was an attorney in the CIA, as well as had started his career as an officer in the U.S. Army JAG Corps. So a wide range of federal government experience from the investigative, law enforcement, intelligence community, and oversight perspectives among this group. So I thank you all for joining us for this conversation. So let's get started. One of the things as this conversation over domestic terrorism, domestic violent extremism is emerging in the country is I think it would be helpful to just set the stage in terms of what agencies are responsible for addressing domestic terrorism. And Josh Campbell, I'm going to come to you first in a moment. What agencies are responsible? Who has the lead for preventing or investigating acts of domestic terrorism? Josh Campbell, in your reporting role, you've covered the domestic disturbances and protests over the summer. You also have investigative experience that's relevant to this. So can you just start us off by talking about who's got the lead for domestic terrorism when it comes to the federal government?
Sure, and thanks, Carrie, and thanks to CNAS for putting on this very important program, a very timely program, obviously an issue that the nation is talking about, as you mentioned, especially in the wake of the January 6th insurrection. I think just to kind of set the stage, when you think about agencies that have jurisdiction or that are stakeholders in trying to counter domestic terrorism, I mean, the big two that come to mind are obviously the FBI and the Department of Homeland Security. And I'll focus on those two. And that's not to say that there aren't other agencies that also assist. Obviously, there's a large group of state, local, other federal agencies across the country who are responsible for doing investigations and for trying to protect, different critical infrastructure, for example. But speaking specifically about FBI and DHS, and I'll say at the outset that there's a lot of overlap between the two. But with the Department of Homeland Security, I mean, the easiest way to think about it is they're responsible for securing the nation against threats, which sounds really broad, right? But obviously it's a very broad mission. The aperture that agency has when it comes to trying to protect the homeland is very wide, and it was instituted for that reason after 9/11, as lawmakers decided that there had to be a cohesive element that sat on top of all these different agencies and organizations. And so DHS was obviously created. I think the easiest way to think about them when compared to the FBI when you talk about domestic terrorism is DHS is focused on critical infrastructure. They're interfacing with federal, state, local partners to share intelligence. One key area that they have been instrumental in is just that, setting up bulletins and conducting analysis about potential threats. And so that's the kind of the DHS side. Now, when it comes to the FBI, and I'll talk at length about that, because the question comes up, how do you stop a domestic terrorist, and especially in the wake of January 6th? People are asking, well, was this an intelligence failure? Was there investigative activity that could have been done? What can we do in the future and the like? And really, folks are really focusing on the FBI, and especially to that question about whether we need a domestic terrorism law. And so I'll just kind of give you the quick rundown of how that agency is organized. I'll hit quickly on the topics and definitions of terrorism. And then I think, interestingly, for this group and for our audience, I'll talk just briefly about some of the cultural trends that I've noticed inside the Bureau in covering the FBI, and then obviously being a former FBI agent who talks regularly with people inside the FBI. Structurally, when you think about terrorism, the way the FBI looks at it, it puts the terrorism issue into two buckets. You have international terrorism, and the easiest way to think about that are individuals and groups that are inspired by foreign terrorist organizations or foreign nation states. You think about ISIS, Al Qaeda. Obviously, in the wake of 9/11, the FBI has really increased their their structure, their presence, the number of people working the IT threat. So there's that IT bucket. And then there's DT, domestic terrorism. And the FBI essentially breaks that down and describes that as people that are acting towards ideological goals that are stemming from some type of domestic influence, a political, social, environmental nature and the like. And it's that topic that we're going to talk about, obviously, at Link today, the DT aspect. Inside the FBI, so you have FBI headquarters, a counterterrorism division that is responsible for program managing all cases across the country and indeed across the world. And it's very much bifurcated. You have the international terrorism element and then a whole domestic terrorism operations section that's responsible for guarding against these kind of threats. And then in the field, there are 56 field offices across the country. Each FBI field office has some squad or some element that's responsible for protecting their so-called domain, knowing their domain, their geographical area of responsibility, knowing what the threats are, having agents and analysts, work cases and work with local partners to try to identify threats and to counter them. And so that's kind of organizationally how it's structured. I think, one thing that's interesting, and we're going to talk a lot about this when we get into discussing the possible need for, new laws and the like, but there are certain limitations on the domestic terrorism side that an agent does not face necessarily on the international terrorism side. And that has been obviously a key factor for much of the debate. In fact, you have the FBI Agents Association that has come out for many years now advocating for new tools, a new law that allows them to, in their words, counter domestic terrorism in a way that maybe they can't do right now. But for purposes of our discussion, I think it's important to talk about limitations. And as an FBI agent, when I was working international terrorism investigations focused on Al-Qaeda and ISIS and foreign groups, merely being associated with one of those groups was enough to warrant investigation and possibly prosecution. And obviously, there's one way you can do it is to go after group leaders. Another way to go after a terrorism network and to try to neutralize it is to go after those who are supporting it. Material support to terrorism is obviously a statute that is often used, but very broad. That is not the case when it comes to domestic terrorism. It is not illegal, it is not unlawful to be associated with a white supremacist, to be associated with a group like the Oath Keepers and the Proud Boys. And so that has really been the debate that the nation is having right now, and people that cover national security, is should the FBI have the same tools to cover domestic terrorism that they have to cover international terrorism? And I know we'll get into a lot of the civil liberties debates, but I think that's important to note as far as how the FBI operates. There are three elements that an FBI agent has to satisfy when opening an investigation. And the first is there proper predication? Is there information or allegation of some type of crime? The second is this a proper use of FBI resources? And then the third, and this is key, especially in the domestic terrorism side, is the agent launching this investigation based solely on someone's exercise of their First Amendment right? They said something, I hate the government, I'm going to overthrow the government, or is there more to it? And as we'll discuss throughout the day, the conversation today, it's those constraints that are there for a reason. I mean, the FBI's history is imperfect. There are dark chapters in the FBI's history when it comes to targeting various groups, and so it's that lingering history that now is informing this debate. People asking that important question. We see threats like January 6th. We see what the insurrectionists did. Why didn't law enforcement stop it is a question that people have. But just as important, the question is, well, do we want to provide law enforcement with the tools that they want, knowing that in the past they have been abused and misused? So that's how the FBI is structured. That's how the FBI goes after these threats. And obviously, that's the big lingering question of the day now is, does the FBI need more tools? Does the FBI need more authorities?
Thanks, Josh. That's a great setup and gives us a really good picture of how the FBI approaches the investigations. I'm going to come to Christian Beckner now. Christian, when you were on the staff of the Senate Homeland Security Committee, you were involved in conducting oversight of the Department of Homeland Security. So can you give us a sense of how DHS's role is different than what Josh Campbell described as to the FBI? Specifically, does DHS investigate domestic terrorism the same way that the FBI does? If not, what is the role of the intelligence and analysis unit, and how does that role of that section, that component, play into the prevention or responding to domestic terrorism threats?
Thanks, Carrie, and thank you to CNAS for hosting this event. So, in answer to your question, I would, looking at DHS, which, as you know, is a very complex, diverse, federal agency, I would put their activities related to domestic terrorism in 4 buckets. First, you have a relatively new Office of Targeted Violence and Terrorism Prevention. They're basically the coordinator for DHS around these issues. They lead some community outreach activities, engagement, and they have grant-making authority to some law enforcement groups and broader civil society groups around these issues. Second, as you mentioned, the Office of Intelligence Analysis, they produce analytic reports on a variety of homeland security threats, including domestic terrorism. The primary audience for those reports is state and local law enforcement. They have strong partnerships with the broader network of state and local fusion centers and state and local law enforcement agencies. So, working to coordinate with them. And also, typically those activities are done in coordination with the FBI, the intelligence side of the FBI, and the National Counterterrorism Center, where you have an international nexus to some of that reporting. And then 2 other issues just to highlight quickly, where you do have an international nexus for some of these domestic terrorist groups, because with some of these white supremacist groups, you see activity in Europe and elsewhere. Customs and Border Protection has a role in terms of screening of foreigners who are trying to travel to the U.S. or who have connections to them, similar to the role that they would play for international terrorism or homegrown violent Islamist extremism. And then fourth, I would highlight the department's role with respect to infrastructure protection, as Josh mentioned earlier. They provide there's a nonprofit grant security program that FEMA runs that provides helps with security at synagogues and mosques and other facilities that are sort of at higher risk of being targeted. And there's been bipartisan support over the past few years to increase funds for that. And then broader activities, in relation to coordinating support for the government facility sector is one of the critical sectors defined within within the framework for infrastructure protection. So I think there are some opportunities to do more around those sets of issues, similar to how with election security, the government created a new sector, but we can come back to that, but thinking more broadly about sort of protecting other parts of civil society that might not be covered by that framework right now.
Okay, thanks, Christian. I want to come to Alexis Collins and bring Alexis into the conversation. Alexis, you prosecuted the international terrorism cases, was in a management role in the counterterrorism section of the National Security Division, which oversees terrorism prosecutions, domestic and international. Can you talk about how the criminal division or the national security division, how did they structure approaching the domestic terrorism cases in particular? Does that get handled out of the national security division? Is that the type of cases that get handled there? Or is there still some divide between things that happen in the criminal division? How does that work from a prosecutorial perspective, working with the U.S. attorney's offices?
Sure, and thank you very much for inviting me to speak on the panel as well on this critical topic. The Department of Justice has taken a layered approach and structure similar to what Josh described for the FBI. The goal is to bring all of government, to the extent that we can, at each level to the issue, so that you have the expertise and you have the coordination to really effectively tackle domestic terrorism. Our frontline boots on the ground prosecutors are all located at the U.S. attorney's offices that are spread around the country, one in each judicial district. And like the FBI field offices, they are looking at working these investigations, working with state and local prosecutors as well to figure out the best response and to prosecute these cases. They also work with their local FBI field office and their local JTTF, which is the Joint Terrorism Task Force, which brings together resources from all of the federal, state, and local law enforcement agencies to bring to bear to investigate these matters. So that's, the frontline boots on the ground. DOJ, as writ large, main justice located here in Washington, D.C., is an overlay on that. And they function to bring subject matter expertise as well as national coordination. So there is the NSD was originally formed out of the 9/11 Commission recommendations to bring together all of the national security-oriented resources of the Department of Justice together into one division under an Assistant Attorney General. And the counterterrorism section is one of the parts of NSD that has authority over both international terrorism and domestic terrorism. And there are special, it's a significant section. There's 40, 50 attorneys in it who all have experience on both sides of these cases, international and domestic terrorism. And they work with the various U.S. attorneys' offices to hand in hand in investigating these cases. They also work with the FBI main headquarters as well. And a critical role, number one, is to develop subject matter expertise so we can come in and help with some of the sticky and thorny issues that often arise in terrorism cases, as well as ensure that there's national coordination. As you can imagine, when you're dealing with groups, white supremacist groups or groups like the Oath Keepers, anti-government militias, they're nationwide. They're not just localized in one specific area. And so it's important that the counterterrorism section and the National Security Division coordinate all of those aspects of the investigation across U.S. attorneys' offices. So that's a very critical function that they play as well, to make sure that there's a national approach and there's coordination. And they also coordinate with the other divisions that may touch domestic terrorism, including the criminal divisions you mentioned, including the Civil Rights Division, which focuses on hate crimes, which, their domestic terrorism also can involve hate crimes, and so they're a critical partner as well as the tax division, which you wouldn't necessarily think is the case, but a lot of the anti-government militias also refuse to pay taxes, or there's issues there that division has control over. So they coordinate with all of those divisions, as well as, when appropriate, with the intelligence community.
Great. I want to bring Alex Joel into the conversation. So, Alex, you spent your government career primarily in the intelligence community at the Office of the Director of National Intelligence, giving advice on civil rights and civil liberties and privacy as it relates to intelligence collection. We're going to turn the conversation in a few minutes to more specifically the debate over whether we need new laws. But before we get there, Alex Joel, I want to ask you, what is the role of the intelligence community when it comes to domestic terrorism? In a hearing this week on Capitol Hill regarding the attack on the Capitol of January 6th, we heard some information about the lack of an intelligence warning. So can you give us the state of play as to what the role is of the intelligence community when it comes to a domestic threat in terms of domestic violent extremists or domestic terrorists?
Sorry about that. Sure, Carrie, I'm happy to do that. Yeah, it's so first of all, I guess I'd say that intelligence of the kind that is being discussed in response to this incident is really what I would say, lowercase I intelligence. It doesn't mean it's coming from the uppercase IC intelligence community. And so there was certainly law enforcement intelligence relating to domestic terrorists that has always been traded among law enforcement agencies to give people a heads up. There is intelligence that's being provided within the law enforcement community, within organizations that are charged with securing infrastructure or securing institutions like the Capitol, that doesn't necessarily come from the intelligence community. And the reason I make that distinction is because the intelligence community, as it's organized in the United States, is primarily focused overseas, is primarily focused on foreign threats to the nation. So national security in that sense is security of the nation from foreign threats from foreign actors. Now, those actors may be operating inside the United States, just like the 9/11 terrorists were. So they had come from overseas, they were inside the United States, and they struck inside the United States. So sometimes people get that mixed up. When I'm talking about foreign focus, I don't mean that the intelligence community is powerless to look inside the United States under all circumstances. Obviously, if we have foreign terrorist organizations sending operatives or recruiting Americans to carry out their goals and objectives inside the United States, you want the ability of the intelligence community to synthesize that information, to go through FBI and DHS to obtain the information that is needed in order to understand that threat. What the intelligence community does not do and should not do, in my view, is focus wholly inside the United States at wholly domestic activities. So people who are not obtaining inspiration from overseas, people who are not acting to further the objectives of a foreign terrorist organization, should be the province of domestic actors like FBI, like DHS, who are also members of the intelligence community. So there are some issues there regarding boundaries, but primarily, and local law enforcement, who will properly exercise their authorities inside the United States. And there's reasons for that distinction. You know, during the 1970s, we had the Church Committee hearings under Senator Frank Church, which uncovered a lot of abuses of that era in terms of the intelligence agencies overstepping boundaries and spying, quote unquote, spying on Americans, infiltrating protest movements, trying to counter what they thought of as these domestic problems, which were war protest movements, civil rights movements, those kinds of things. And we really don't want our intelligence agencies acting in that way, not only because we don't want them disrupting democracy or interfering with First Amendment freedoms, but also in particular because the intelligence community has access to certain special authorities, right? So we give our intelligence agencies the ability to keep things secret. They have much greater ability to keep things secret than other agencies in government do. This is necessary to counter foreign threats. If you are too transparent about, and I'm a big believer in transparency, but if you are overly transparent, then adversaries will adjust their methods and the nation's security will be harmed. So you have to be very careful about to what extent you can reveal information to the public or to a party that you're focused on when you're conducting national security activities. You don't want that same secrecy to apply in a law enforcement investigation. And in fact, you can't, because the law enforcement investigation's role is ultimately, I mean, not always, but generally is to result in a prosecution, to bring somebody to trial and to put them behind bars if they are committing a crime, right? So under our Constitution and our system of government, you are building a case with evidence that ultimately will be disclosed to the defendant in order for that defendant to exercise their constitutional rights to a fair trial. In an intelligence context, the ultimate goal is not necessarily a prosecution. It is to gather and understand and warn. So there are other goals in an intelligence community activity, and one of the concerns for intelligence agencies when they're doing that is that they don't want their methods to be exposed in a court of law. So there is going to be this tension right away, just in terms of the use of these authorities, which are intended to be focused overseas, as well as the need to protect the tradecraft and the tools and methods that the intelligence community uses. I think the intelligence agencies can certainly look for foreign connections, and they should. And I think that we can have this discussion, but based on some of the information that's out there, these groups that may be acting inside the United States may be part of a broader international movement or ideology. There are other groups overseas that they're in conversation with and in communication with. And in fact, those overseas groups may be taking inspiration from US groups. So that's an interesting angle that I hadn't thought of before. But it's really that search for that foreign connection, I think, that is where the intelligence community ought to be.
Alex, thanks for that. I think that's so all of you have really done a great job in terms of setting the foundation. So I want to narrow the conversation a little bit more, and let's talk about January 6th. The takeaway from one of the hearings this week that was featured the former chief of the Capitol Police and Sergeant at Arms, a lot of the headlines that came out of that hearing was that there was an intelligence failure. For my part, I'm not yet convinced. I have not yet seen facts that have been reported publicly that indicate that the failure to secure the Capitol was a result of an intelligence failure as opposed to operational or security failure. I also haven't yet seen facts supporting the assertion that a gap in the law is what prevented security measures from being taken more specifically. And yet, in the wake of these events, we already are seeing, as I mentioned at the top of the program, we already are seeing increasing calls for a new domestic terrorism law. So Alexis Collins, I want to come to you as a former prosecutor, because it seems to me, as I've been looking at the laws that have been, that are implicated by January 6th in particular, it seems like our laws are actually pretty good in terms of being able to be used by prosecutors to handle the individuals that participated. So, for example, we've got laws on the books about rebellion and insurrection. We have laws on the books about seditious conspiracy, and that's not to mention sort of all of the more bread and butter criminal violations that were that individuals who participated in January 6th have been charged with in terms of, being on the Capitol grounds, trespassing on the Capitol grounds, violent activity at the Capitol, and things like that. So as a former counterterrorism prosecutor, what is your perspective on whether or not the current state of law is sufficient to address the domestic terrorism threat?
I think when you look at it from the perspective of how do we have the laws that are sufficient to cover the reaction to the January 6th event? As you pointed out, there are laws against destroying federal property. There are laws against assaulting federal police officers and things like that. So there, I like you don't necessarily see a gap, a significant gap. There are small things that could be done. For example, adding a conspiracy element to some of the statutes that have been used in some of these charges. So, for example, the obstruction statute, adding conspiracy would increase the statutory maximum. That's possible. So there are little things like that. But in terms of large gaps, I tend to agree with you. But when you take a step back, a lot of this discussion about adding a domestic terrorism law is not necessarily new and in reaction to January 6th. For the past several years, as particularly white supremacist extremist violence has stepped up, this discussion has been ongoing. I think it came to a head with January 6th, but it's not necessarily a new discussion. And in that respect, there have been some arguments made that there are gaps that may need to be filled. Each of those suggestions carry with them a policy decision that needs to be made, and that is where a lot of the debate is on. You can fill those gaps, but should you? And so just some examples, people have pointed out that our terrorism laws and our federal laws in general tend to target very big events, explosions, using explosives, bombings, things like that, assaults specifically on federal facilities or officers. But a lot of the domestic terrorism activity that we've seen over the past few years has been on softer, smaller targets and different types of conduct. So, for example, mass shootings or vehicle attacks. And there is not a good fit under federal law for that. Those have been charged primarily as state law crimes. And so that's a policy question. Do you want to federalize that sort of conduct? And so there have been many suggestions around that. There's also discussion of the fact that, as I think Josh mentioned earlier, there are some specific laws that are targeted specifically at international terrorism that tend to be very broad and give the government the ability to disrupt behavior that's maybe leading to an attack at a very early stage and target supporters of that. And because for the international terrorist aspect of it, there's a crime, particularly the material support law, where people are outlawed from providing material support to a foreign terrorist organization. It doesn't matter whether that person wanted to further the violent goals of that organization or not. You can't provide support to that organization. Nothing like that exists for domestic organizations for good reasons. The First Amendment, protecting freedom of association, and that sort of thing. But there are ways that are being proposed that may get closer to that goal so that you can more easily prosecute and investigate supporters and these plots before they ripen into a specific attack. be able to disrupt them much earlier. So that is the debate that we see happening now, and I see will be happening for the next 6 months to a year as we try to figure out how to tackle this problem.
Thanks for that, Alexis. I want to come to Alex Joel. Alex, can you weigh in from the constitutional and the civil, put your civil liberties hat on, when we're talking about potentially crafting new laws in this space, how does the First Amendment piece come into this? What's different about considering the First Amendment or other constitutional concerns when we're looking at the domestic terrorism or violent extremist issue versus the international side?
Yeah, and I think Alexis touched on this. I think it's very, very tricky, and I think it's going to be it's a fraught area to get into. So obviously, Americans have the right to express their views. They have the right to express their views in extreme ways. They have the right to petition the government. They have the right to protest, to organize themselves, to have all these associations. I don't want to go on and on about the First Amendment, but the First Amendment is perhaps the most fiercely defended amendment in the Bill of Rights by the Supreme Court. So it is, and for good reason, right? And that is how we express ourselves. That's how we act in a democracy. So it's the earlier you go, the further away you go from the act of violence, or the less specifically tied in you are to a violation of criminal law, apart from holding and expressing extreme views. And I'm going to separate out the incitement to immediate violence, which of course is not protected by the First Amendment. But the further away you go from an actual violent act being planned or other criminal act being conducted or planned, I think the harder it is for you, as for us as a government, to act in that area. And again, this is fairly obvious. Overseas, where the First Amendment doesn't apply, we are able to study foreign terrorist organizations, people who might be members of those organizations, to understand their associations in ways that are more difficult inside the United States, as it should be, unless, of course, you're talking about a criminal conspiracy or a criminal organization, which the FBI and other law enforcement agencies have a lot of familiarity. So to the extent that you're now going to create a law that could criminalize these earlier, otherwise non-criminal forms of association or freedom of expression. I know that's not what Alexis is suggesting, but that you've asked me to draw where the danger lies. That is, I think, where the danger lies.
Thanks. That's exactly what I was hoping you would articulate, Alex. I'm going to come to Josh Campbell. First, Josh, put your former investigator hat on. Can you weigh in as to what's your take as far as whether dedicating our federal government resources more towards the growing domestic terrorism threat, is this a law and authorities problem, or is this more of a prioritization and resourcing issue from your perspective as a former investigator?
It depends on who you ask. As I alluded to earlier, the FBI Agents Association, the organization that represents 13,000 plus agents, has been a proponent of a new domestic terrorism law. And in their view, what they're saying is, look, we want more tools to be able to go after this threat and to treat them like we do international terrorism groups. And it's also interesting that I think that one of the other, maybe perhaps more persuasive arguments for those who are advocating for new domestic terrorism laws actually comes from a former prosecutor in the Southern District of New York, who wrote in the Washington Post that it sends the message about what society is willing to accept. And if we criminalize domestic terrorism, you send that message throughout society that this is not something that we are going to permit as a society. When you talk about violent white supremacists and those advocating the overthrow of the government, if a prosecutor can tell a jury that this person is a terrorist and what they did is unacceptable, they believe that sends a message. So that's kind of their side of the issue. I don't think personally, and I say this as a former FBI agent, that those advocating for new domestic terrorism laws have done enough to state their case. And I say that because you look at the other side of this issue, where again, you have people that are very much concerned about civil liberties, that look to the past and look to experience and how law enforcement and intelligence agencies have sometimes abused these authorities that they had. that is a heavy burden to overcome for those who are asking for more authorities. And I don't know that they have achieved that. I think, all of us would probably agree that achieving full security in the United States, preventing domestic terrorism is possible if you don't care about civil liberties, right? If you don't care about civil liberties, you can bring all the weight of the state to bear in order to surveil people, to go after them. But of course, this is a society that values civil liberties over almost everything else. And so that is kind of this ongoing debate. And those who are saying that, no, we don't need a terrorism law, point to the issue of resources, that perhaps there are other ways to satisfy the FBI agents' concern. And that is perhaps adding more agents to go after domestic terrorism, more analysts to go after the threat. There's also a question, this kind of gets a little bit in the weeds, but I know FBI and DHS came out recently asking for state and local law enforcement to report whenever they uncover incidents of possible, hate crimes and domestic terrorism that they see. So then the federal government knows about that. That's not mandatory, but that's yet another instance of possibly kind of getting around maybe new laws, but still allowing the authorities to do their job. And then there's just an idea of setting up tripwires. After 9/11, what the FBI realized is we did not have enough tripwires, enough sources, informants, people, online, covert employees, undercover employees, those kinds of things under existing laws. And so they started plussing that up in order to try to go after the law. The last thing I'll say on that, and this is a very compelling argument for those saying that, we don't need new laws, is you have to be very careful about who is in power and how they might use particular laws. And one person described to me, this was a advocate for civil liberties, a very vocal advocate, who described, for example, under the Trump administration, where you had Donald Trump last year and his Attorney General William Barr, out there pounding the podiums, talking about far left violence and how these far leftists were taking over our cities and Antifa and the like. Whereas in reality, when you look at the statistics from the Justice Department, right-wing extremism is much more dangerous than left-wing extremism. And so what I wonder is, and I was on the ground in Portland covering these protests and in other countries covering protests, is imagine if a president, and pick your poison, whether it's a populist on the right, on the left, imagine it's someone in power who has the authority to go after what they view as extremists, and they have a law on the books saying, for example, that association with domestic terrorism is a crime. I think about in Portland, for example, I was there covering it, and you had medics who were there, people who volunteered to come. And as police and some of these protesters and some of the violent protesters would clash, these medics would be on hand to render aid and render care. And so, is that association with a domestic terrorists? If there's a law that says that, are we going to prosecute medics? I don't know if you all remember this, the images of the wall of moms in Portland, right? Where you had this big group of moms that came marching through downtown Portland, hundreds and hundreds of them, saying that, look, we are going to stand with those advocating for racial justice, those advocating for policing reform. And some of these moms were handing out water to some of the protesters. And yes, a very small group of those protesters were trying to attack this building. So we're going to start charging, moms, the walls of moms, with domestic terrorism association. My point is, and this is maybe a bit hyperbolic, but it's that slippery slope that you have to worry about who is in power, how these laws will be used. And so I think the persuasive argument at this point probably rests with those who are saying there's no law necessary because of everything on the books, as you mentioned. It's unlawful to be an insurrectionist, to engage in sedition, to violently try to overthrow the U.S. government. I think it's just a matter of resources. And those who believe that, maybe we do need a law, I think they need to do a better job of stating their case, because at this point, I don't think we've had that national conversation that is tipping this in their favor.
All right, that's great. Let me bring Christian Beckner back into the conversation. Christian, from your perspective of having worked on the staff of the Senate Homeland Security Committee, how is Congress going to take this on? We've already started to hear proposals to have a commission that looks at January 6th in particular. But how, from your perspective, having worked with the Senate, how is Congress going to take on this issue, not only of January 6th, but of whether or not there needs to be more authorities to be able to prevent acts of domestic terrorism or counter domestic violent extremism?
Sure. So, so thinking about this issue, you've seen some of these proposals in the last few days for a 9/11 commission, like, new commission studying January 6th. I mean, I don't know that the analogy to the 9/11 commission, which, as took nearly, that report didn't come out until nearly 3 years after 9/11, is necessarily the right analogy here. I think, we started to see some of these oversight investigative activities with the hearings this week. I would suggest that, Congress should break this up into two distinct streams. One is sort of the specific review of, what happened at the Capitol, and bringing in outside experts, former government officials, former officials from the private sector, who are responsible for the security of public spaces. Think about like the NFL, or think about international hotel chains, other areas where you have similar physical security issues with, large numbers of people and needing to protect those, those types of facilities, and do that review of physical security at the Capitol and make adjustments, hopefully with the goal of still keeping it a publicly accessible set of buildings, that, for people's right to sort of petition and, be present, with respect to the legislative function. Second, I would, I think, we'll be 20 years past September 11th this fall. And I think, Congress, could do a sort of longer term independent review of our broader counterterrorism posture on a whole of government basis, sort of looking at, what we're doing, what we still need, what frankly we don't need anymore, in terms of, things that are redundant or less effective at preventing both international and domestic terrorism, and really look holistically at those issues. And so I think, having some sort of expert panel with, congressionally sponsored on those issues would have some benefit, with a time frame of sort of, over the next, over the course of the next year to work on those issues. And just wanted to add on one thing to what Josh was speaking on earlier. I think, the most important thing that Congress can do here is really around, really around funding. And you have, I mean, the FBI, the number of special agents has grown by about, 20-25% since 9/11. Their responsibilities in terms of the number of issues they're responsible to investigate has grown much more than that. So, if you think about, cybersecurity, the growth of international terrorism, white collar crime and financial crime becoming much more complex, I do think there's a case to make to, over the next few years, sort of increase the number of FBI special agents and support personnel, or short of that, looking at sort of how you rebalance some of those responsibilities among other federal law enforcement agencies.
Thanks, Christian. I want to bring in a question that was posed by an audience member a little bit earlier, that maybe, Christian, I'm going to come back to you on this because it's related to Congress as well, and then I'll see if anyone else has a comment as well. But it pertains to how we talk about the threat posed by these domestic extremist groups without inadvertently providing them with more of a platform and more of a public platform. So, Christian, maybe I'll ask you that first, as it pertains to how policymakers can discuss these threats without inadvertently giving them sort of more air. And then, Josh, I'm going to ask you that question as well, because I think it has a media angle to it as well. So, Christian, go ahead. Yeah,
I mean, that's, there's no easy answer to that. And that is always a conundrum with also the media coverage of these groups. And, when you just think about sort of the effect of, coverage of school shootings, and does that create a amplifying effect for, for additional, shootings of that nature. So I think, so I think that's something that, individuals need to be careful about. And so I don't necessarily know I have a good answer on that, other than, there are ways to, talk about, be consistent in terms of how you talk about these groups, and, make them not, appear appealing, by describing them as terrorist groups or terrorist organizations.
Josh, any take on that one?
Yeah, I think that you hit on the media, and obviously the media has an important responsibility here as well. And what I often think about is what my colleague at CNN, Christian Beckner, often says, and that's that, our job isn't to be neutral, it's to be truthful. And what I mean by that is, when I'm covering white supremacy, when I'm covering domestic extremists who are trying to violently overthrow the government, my goal, and this goes for government as well when it comes to talking publicly about these issues, I don't sit there and say, okay, people who are against white supremacy believe this. Let me go find a white supremacist and get their side of the story, right? I mean, that is a judgment we're making. I could care less about the white supremacist side of the story because that is not something that we obviously accept in civilized society. And so that's important, first of all, to not provide some, improper, balance on an issue that where there shouldn't be. The same reason that you won't find me sticking a microphone in the face of a Proud Boy or some other type of radical extremist and say, can you please give us your side of the story? Because we know that those who engage in violence, they crave that attention, which often A, makes them look even more powerful than they are, but B, has the very real possibility of serving as just a vehicle to spread that kind of messaging. And so I think that's important for folks to keep in mind. That said, we can cover actions, we can cover what people have done. For example, I've covered more mass shootings than I would like, including those by white supremacists. And you rarely hear me talking about their name. They're mentioning their name, but I can describe their actions. And so that part is important. And then just kind of backing up to our policymakers as well. This is a national conversation that has to take place, especially of those who are advocating new laws. There has to be a national level policy, informing the public, at least a conversation. I think we can achieve that without unnecessarily providing publicity to some of these groups, as long as we do it in the right way.
Thanks for that. I want to bring in one more aspect to this conversation on domestic violent extremism that we haven't talked about yet this hour, and that is the prevalence of current or former law enforcement or military personnel who either participated in January 6th attack on the Capitol or also are either part of some of the domestic violent extremist groups or targets for recruitment. So for example, if we look at the Oath Keepers, for example, that is a group that deliberately targets former military or law enforcement personnel. So Alexis Collins, let me start with you from a law enforcement and a prosecutor's perspective. Is there anything different about how the Justice Department would approach those types of cases versus anybody else in the country? And then I'm going to go to Alexis, and then Alex, I'm going to ask you to comment sort of from the perspective of looking, how does the government, when it's looking to prevent threats, look internally? But Alexis Collins, let me start with you.
Sure, and that's a huge issue that was particularly on display at the January 6th insurrection. As you noted, a lot of the groups that have been under scrutiny and have been very active.
I think Alexis is, we lost her on tech. Alexis, we lost your tech for a moment. I'm going to see which of my other panelists are with me for a second in terms of being able to respond to that. Josh, you have also served in the military. Do you have a thought from a former investigator's perspective, or perhaps from your military experience, as to how we should be thinking about this in terms of rooting out a piece of this which involves current or former military or law enforcement?
Yeah, just, I mean, to put simply, the police and military have to do a better job, and it's as simple, nothing simple, but it's just as simple as understanding the threat landscape. And when you realize, as a law enforcement or military leader, that there are groups out there that are actively discussing amongst themselves, how do we get people with tactical paramilitary experience into our ranks? That has to give you pause, and they just simply have to do a better job. And not to point fingers at Congress all the time, but they have a role as well in holding these law enforcement and military agencies accountable to ensure that they're doing the kind of internal reviews that they need to do, because this isn't theoretical. We know, based on our reporting, based on hearing from law enforcement intelligence sources, that these groups are actively trying to identify those who are in the ranks. And then finally, I'll say that the Defense Department, I think, has done a very good job lately. The services have started doing their own they call stand downs, which is basically you get everyone together and sensitize them to this issue. If you know someone, one of your partners, one of your buddies, one of your colleagues who's going down this route, you need to let us know. And it's simply having that conversation and sensitizing people that's so important.
Great, thanks for that. And it might have been my tech that was a little glitchy for a second there. So I'm going to come back to I'm going to ask each of the remaining panelists, as we're winding down our time here, to comment on this issue of how to deal with the issue of law enforcement or military who may be part of these groups. So I'm going to come to Alexis, and then Christian, and then Alex, Joel. Alexis, go ahead. Thanks. You can finish your thought.
Sure. Picking up on what Josh just said, I think that it's very important for law enforcement and the military to figure out how to root out this sort of extremism that we've seen in their ranks. It undermines the public trust and confidence in our law enforcement and in our military when they know that there are extremist forces working within it. From a prosecution perspective, I think it's very important to hold people, former law enforcement and military, accountable for the violent actions that they participated in at the January 6th insurrection or elsewhere. It brings a heightened level of danger and risk of violence and injury when you have folks who are trained in tactics that the ordinary person doesn't have access to. And so we saw that actually in some of the videos that were shown during the impeachment trial and elsewhere online, showing people who had that sort of training being able to work their way through a crowd using those techniques to further the attack. And that is very dangerous and requires accountability.
Thanks so much for that. Christian Beckner, do you have a thought on this, or also as we're winding down our time, you can feel free to offer any concluding thoughts you may have as well to the conversation?
Yeah, sure. On that question about sort of particularly with respect to the military, I think it's critical that the FBI have close connections with each of the defense criminal investigative services that are in each military branch. I know, many of them are represented on joint terrorism task forces, and there are other ways for that information sharing to occur back and forth between them. But there have been gaps in that cooperation in the past. I worked on the Senate Committee's investigation of the Fort Hood terrorist attack in 2009, and we saw some gaps between DoD and the FBI in terms of what they knew about sort of Nadal Hassan and his radicalization. So I think making sure that those ties are strong and that coordination is active between the FBI and and the service investigative agencies is very important here.
Thanks, Christian. And now I'm going to come, as we're winding down our last minute or two here, I'm going to come back to Alex, Joel. Alex, if you have a comment on this sort of internal threat or former law enforcement or military issue, as well as any other sort of final big picture thoughts that you would like to offer from a civil liberties perspective as the country is thinking about how to address the domestic threat.
Sure. I think in terms of the looking internally inside at the law enforcement organizations and the military, I just as a reminder, I think it really goes without saying they also have First Amendment rights. We have to be very careful. Focus on conduct. Focus on violent acts or planning of violent acts rather than merely holding or expressing a view that may not be popular, may not be a popular one. Just more broadly, I do think the 9/11 can teaches us important lessons. Obviously, this is very different from 9/11. We're focusing on something inside versus outside, and that has huge differences across the board in a number of different areas. But one thing that I think is important to learn as well is using it as a galvanizing event to look inside, look at our processes. Are we communicating between agencies correctly? Have we prioritized things? And do we have people focused on the civil liberties and privacy implications of this particular kind of activity, which may be different? If we're going to be doing something different inside the United States, we really ought to have a lot of good, smart people focused on the civil liberties and privacy issues that could come up.
Thanks, Alex. Thanks for those thoughts. And I want to thank everybody who joined us for this conversation as a viewer. These are issues at the Center for New American Security that we're going to continue to be working on and thinking on. And I want to thank each of the panelists for joining us today: Christian Beckner, Josh Campbell, Alexis Collins, and Alex Joel. Thank you so much for offering your time and your expertise with us today.